Sally Field, welcome to Q.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. I have so much to talk to you about.
Okay, good.
And I mean, some of the stuff is not so easy to talk to you about. But I have to say, of all the book interviews I've done, I rarely start with this question. In fact, I can't even think of a
Oh,
time
dear
I've started
God,
with
what
this
are you
question.
gonna-
How dare you? No. You started, the book's called In Pieces. I would rarely start with the title, is what I mean. But it seems like when you read the book, your life is truly different pieces of your life. So tell me a little bit about the title.
Wow. It applies to so many things, actually. When my mother passed away on my 65th birthday 7 years ago, I thought I had done all the right things. I'd had those conversations, and we had, resolved anything left that needed to be resolved, I thought. And yet I was so deeply disquieted, like there was some urgent thing, like something festering on me, and I couldn't find out where the wound was. And I felt I had to dig in, find all the pieces of my life, and put them out in front of me, and put them together, piece them together, to see what picture it was that I was missing. That if I couldn't do that, then I would never be able to move on. I would always feel this deeply disquieted, anxious feeling inside of me. And so that's what I did. I began to uncover and look for the pieces, the parts and pieces of myself, and information that I'd never wanted to know.
Well, I want to be clear for people listening to this that this isn't necessarily a metaphorical putting the pieces together, because you actually did have unopened letters.
Yes.
You had parts of journals in which you had left certain details out.
Yeah.
And you had unopened reviews that you had never read.
Right.
Were they in a box in your house somewhere?
Yes. I carted around through, 30, 40 years, boxes of memorabilia, and I never went through them. Certainly boxes of all the journals I had kept, and they were precious to me. So some piece of me, some part of my brain knew to keep them, knew that even though I wasn't willing to read this letter that came to me, in my 40s, even though I wasn't capable of reading it at the time because I wasn't strong enough, I didn't want to know what was inside, I didn't throw it away, that someday I would need to know that. And that's what this was. And I went in and uncovered things, went back and read things in my journal that I had actually written down. But when I had written it down, I then released it completely from my mind as if it didn't exist. And only now in this 7-year period of trying to put the pieces in place, put me together, did I have wait a minute, did that really happen? Did I write that down?
Is that cathartic?
I can't say I was looking for catharsis. I wasn't. I was looking to understand. And catharsis to me is a kind of aha, some sort of,
an epiphany or something like that.
and it wasn't that. I was looking for my mother. I was looking for some resolve inside myself, with my life, with me, which had to do with my relationship with my mother. And that's what it was.
Tell me about your mom.
She was really a complicated, wonderful person, but very complicated, very human. And she was an actress. She was very beautiful. She was put under contract before I was born from somebody who just spotted her in a theater during the war, when my real father was away in the war, and World War II. And she was put under contract to Paramount, and she'd never thought of being an actor. She just she'd been going to City College in Pasadena, and I don't know that she had any real desires to have any career. She didn't come from women who had careers. She was married to my father, as I said, who was away in the war. But when she was put under contract to Paramount, other than giving her, elocution lessons and how to posture lessons and how to sound like the flavor of the month, whatever actress that was, she had the great opportunity to study with Charles Laughton, the phenomenal actor. I think arguably one of the great film actors, even though I hear he was even better on stage, that ever was. And that was the beginning of a love affair that she always had with the craft, with the art of acting that really got, imprinted in her from her work with him.
You're telling us about your mom. Your mom factors so much into this book, as you've already let us know. I want to open up the story a little bit. So your mom ends up marrying a stuntman named Jack Mahoney, who everyone calls Jocko.
Jocko.
It seems like a very glamorous story until we discover, and you're very candid about this, and this is where I say some of these things aren't easy to ask you about, that your father, your stepfather, is sexually abusing you. And then we read this passage. Mom, where are you? I want to look up and see you coming to help me. I've adored you all my life, fiercely believing my own fairy tale about you. And during those important years, you abandoned me. So where was she?
I don't know. I mean, I asked that question genuinely.
Yeah.
I don't know. And part of the quest is in having a picture of her. So perhaps I can figure out that time a little more clearly, and understanding him, understanding her, seeing my brother in it and my sister, and ultimately the evolution of me, of how that survival system that got created as a child in me, the survival mechanism that allowed me to navigate very complicated emotional terrain as a child of 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. And I needed to understand that system and how it got placed there, what exactly it was, because I've spent my lifetime trying to untangle it. And I think as adults, we all do that, whether you come from a traumatic childhood or from just any childhood. The mechanisms that get ingrained in you as a child, and they worked very well as a child, quite possibly, but as an adult, they no longer serve you. And how you get out of that garment is very difficult. And I think part of this for me was in trying to see the system of survival so that I could move away from it. And it was no longer holding me stationary. So I was no longer seeing things through the eyes of a child.
It's funny you mentioned survival so much, because in the book you read about a child who's obviously struggling with understanding why this is happening, how you can still have a relationship with people when this is happening to you, the understanding of what your mother knows and what your mother doesn't know, and just trying to grapple things that with no child should have to grapple with. And then on top of that, you also start a career very young. I can't imagine what it was like. I mean, you were Gidget, which was this sort of sunny, bright character. You were the flying nun, which I think you'd once described as sort of the bottom of the rung of the sitcom world. But it was a pleasant, happy character. I can't imagine having to play those roles with such kind of darkness swirling around you.
Oh, but I had those characters too. I mean, I was also in Pieces, and there was, and has always been a very strong aspect, piece, personality of me that is very sunny and Gidget, and I love her. Yeah. She was incredibly important to me, and still is, and still, lives within me. That's able to be. She is that aspect of me is joyous and gleeful and finds fun in things, and yet there are aspects of me that aren't that are dark and sad and furious, and that also deals with the title of In Pieces.
But you also talk about about being in a fog for much of your life, except when you were acting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, I think part of I've heard from other people who have come from trauma in their childhood, that part of my survival mechanism, certainly as I was moving into adolescence, was to put myself in a fog so that feelings were less sharp. Everything was numbed to a degree, and I couldn't really perceive a lot of the feelings and complexities that were going on inside of me. And out of fear, a lot of it was, there was so much fear riding around in the danger of it.
Fear of what?
Well, when you live with a man who's potentially dangerous, and you adore him, that's a very frightening place for a child.
Right.
You don't know what part is going to be there. You can't really rely on anything, and that's dangerous. That's not something that has any kind of feeling of safety. Right. And so the fog is created to keep you feel safe within the fog. You feel safer within the fog. And as a result, in high school, I could hardly read a book or focus on. I certainly couldn't do math or anything that called on that part of my brain, because it would call for me to be too engaged in what was happening.
Right.
But I could memorize a poem. I could memorize dialogue. And when I finally found a stage at 12, something happened. The fog cleared, a bell rang, and I could hear myself, and I could react now to whomever was across from me. In whatever way it was, it didn't matter whether it was likable or not likable, or how people wanted me to be or didn't want me to be. It's what I really was.
And you knew something you knew how to do, something that you could do.
No, I didn't know how to do it. I knew not one
But
thing.
something you had a path towards knowing how to do.
But I didn't. I mean, my whole life long, I've been seeking that. It's a feeling of being utterly, exquisitely alive. Something. I learned a craft because within that craft, there will be moments that you take flight, that you're not rooted to the ground. You're just alive. And that's what I found when I was 12. It was a moment, and then it was gone. And then I didn't know what to do with my hands. And, and then you're like, oh.
That's the actual craft part.
The actual craft is what I spent my lifetime chasing, trying to learn, so that those moments might actually happen again.
So I want to come back to the story a little bit. Your mother eventually did learn about what had happened to you as a child, but she didn't know the whole story at first. That's right?
I mean, I think I describe in the book everything that I know, and we, at the end of the book, we finally talk about it. So that's all I know.
I think we remember. I think when a parent is dying, and I know this from my own experience, that we plan to have these sort of full house moments, I call them, where there's strings playing in the background, and Danny Tanner leans down and tells DJ how, this is what's going to happen at the end of your life. But at the end of someone's life, it can be uncomfortable. It can be awkward. It can be hard to have those kind of...
It's hard to look at death,
It's hard to have those kind of conversations. But I know you write about it so poignantly in the book, but I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that conversation you had with your mom.
Yikes, really? Well, then why read the book? So it is the end of the book, and in some reasons, I think it was why I felt so compelled to write it. All of this, because this stayed so vividly alive in my head, and yet still I felt so unresolved when I shouldn't have. That I had these it's almost like I'm not really sure what part of it you want me to tell.
Well, just tell me.
The conversation that I had with her, and then she said, "You'll never be alone in this," or the conversation I had with her when I was standing in the trailer when I was doing Lincoln, and after we'd had the conversation, and I asked her, and she was going to hang on. She was literally hanging on to her life until I got home from filming Lincoln. And every day I would call her, and I could hear it being a little bit harder and a little bit harder for her to breathe. And I one day said, if you can't hold on any longer, I'll understand. And I don't know why I said that. And she said, well, what, you think I'm going to croak? And I said, no, I just wanted you to know that I'll understand if it gets too hard to hold on. I won't be mad. And And is it that conversation? And I asked her who she wanted to come get her, because it was a conversation I'd heard her to have with my grandmother. And this is, again, like I'm saying, I'm repeating what's in the book.
Yeah, for sure.
And that conversation were the last words I said to her. And I said, Mom, will you come get me? And she said, I will be there, Sally. When you close your eyes, I will be the one. I will come and get you. And those are the last words she said to me.
Those are beautiful last words. Those are last words that people would die for, People would.
Well, she did.
People would love to have that moment of closure.
I know.
So
and
many people don't get that,
And that's why I couldn't figure out why I felt so disquieted. So I took me 7 years and wrote this.
So tell me a little bit about that. I don't want to know the process of it. I don't want to know
You don't want to know my everyday...
I don't really want to know the publishing and all that stuff, but I can only imagine emotionally the process of actually writing all of this down, because I when I first picked up the book, Sally, with all due respect to you, I thought, this will be a memoir about, she was in this role and then this thing happened and then, she got this guy, your kind of typical celebrity memoir. And I think one of the things that is the conversation that's happening around this book is that it's anything but. And it took a lot of bravery, and it took at least a lot of giving to write this book. So tell me about the process of having to give all that out, about putting all this down.
Well, like I said, it was really for myself, this search for something I felt, an urgency to find. Urgency that took 7 years, but I had no publisher. I had nobody on my team. I finally reached out to a literary agent in New York who boldly reached out to someone who, seemed to represent some of the writers that I most admire, like Elizabeth Strout and Jane Smiley and Frank McCord, who arguably wrote one of the great memoirs ever, Angela's Ashes. And this was early on, so it was like 7 years ago. And she said, well, thank you so much for reaching out to me. I don't think we're a fit. And I went, okay. But she said she would love to read a speech of mine that I had written for the Omega Institute, upstate New York, which is essentially the last chapter of the book. And then she and I met, and she was the one that said, she said, when I talk to you, I'm not sure you know what the story is. And I said, I don't. She said, so this is what I want you to do. I want you to write 50, 80 pages. And if I respond to that, I'll represent that and not you. Now, you're making a face, and people make a face, but that absolutely was what I wanted to hear. It meant that if she read those 50 to 80 pages, if she felt that the work was worth her time and expertise, then she would take it on. And it wouldn't be that she was trying to sell some preconceived idea of a celebrity.
Right.
And whatever book I wrote, it was not going to be any preconceived idea of me or a celebrity or whatever. And so that 50 pages that she told me to write 7 years ago turned into 80, turned into 100, turned into a year, turned into 2 years, turned into 3 years, and 200 pages, and 250 pages, and 7 years later. 7 years later, last September, so literally a year ago, I said, Molly, guess what? I have a manuscript. And I sent it to her, and I thought, I completely expected Molly to go, what a nice try. Isn't that a nice try? Well
done.
Well done. We're going to have to figure out how we can get you some education and fix it up a little bit.
And it'll do really well for the bottom of the bird cage. It'll be great.
That's what I thought, and that's not what she did. I said, Molly, I finished it, but I don't know that I have the guts to publish it or do anything with it except keep it and maybe give it to my kids someday. And she said, I'm the one here yelling and screaming, urging you to publish it. Right. And these are the editors I want you to meet with. I
read that even the day before publishing. I think I read an interview where you were still not sure whether you wanted it to come out even then.
Absolutely. My wonderful, wonderful editor, Millicent Bennett. I kept saying, Millicent, is it too late to just change my mind and maybe we could think about it, maybe next year, maybe the following year after that even, or maybe like literally when I'm on my deathbed. What about that?
How you feel now that it's out? You feeling good?
I don't know. I completely back in my fog, I think. I don't know. I can't really tell.
I mean, it's weird because it's one thing to write all this stuff down. It's another thing to imagine people reading it.
I know.
It's another thing to have people like me, strangers, asking you questions about
I
it.
tell you what, Tom.
Yeah.
This is the thing that I realized in my wanderings around and wondering what. I worked for 7 years to try, even in a fledgling way, to understand the craft of writing, a craft I have great and deep regard for. It would be only in trying to learn a craft would I force myself to go to the places I didn't want to go. Just the way it was in learning the craft of acting, I forced myself to learn pieces of myself I didn't want to know. So when I did all of that, and I in all that I was doing, all the books I was reading and was really trying to educate myself into learning a craft and digging as deep as I possibly could dig, I realized it was like working really, really hard and doing the most exquisite portrayal of Juliet in your living room. There was something missing. There was still a piece missing. And the piece is you. Mm-hmm. The piece is audience. Mm-hmm. My whole life long has been somehow connected to this dark, faceless, and yet very familiar thing, this audience. And I have always felt a connection. It is a conversation. So if I didn't put this out here, if I didn't say, here it is, then there would be a piece missing.
If you're just tuning in, I'm speaking with Sally Field, who just released a memoir called In Pieces, which tells the story of her life growing up in California, of her careers, and also her survival of being abused as a child. Like I said, you started working on this book 7 years. We've been saying that number 7 years an awful lot.
Seven.
And a lot has happened in those 7 years. In the meantime, in those 7 years, we've seen the rise of the Me Too movement. We've seen a widespread public conversation for the first time in a very long time about women's safety. I do not want to imply, and it's not my implication, and I don't mean to say that this book, when I say, is this book timely, to mean that it was written for these movements. Because A, I can tell this is a very personal book, and B, this book took 7 years, long before these conversations are happening. But now that it's out, speaking of its reception being the art, I mean, it's kind of Lynchian to say that it's only in its reception is art. But do you see this book perhaps being part of that conversation that's happening right now?
I don't know. I can't really tell. The episodes I talk about in this are really not used as ways to lash out at any of the things that happened to me or the people who perpetrated them. It is really an examination of myself within that, examination of how all of this fit into a sort of a preformed rut in my road, how I was predisposed to put myself and to respond as I did. It's not really examining them or examining whether the situation was right or wrong. It only talks about my feeling within it. And I do, even though I say that, I am very appreciative of the fact that women are now speaking out. But I know that the outrage is number one. You know, that's the first thing. Loud, screaming, rage, outrage of wrong. This behavior has to stop. But that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. There has to be something else on the other side of it to change society, because it has to do with how we raise our little boys and our little girls. That bad behavior comes from somewhere. And men, I raised 3 sons. Men are raised also in a very tight little box, you know, to behave like a man. What is that? It disallows them a great deal of themselves, of their humanity, of their softness, of their tenderness, of their instinct. You know, their instincts are cut off from themselves because they're not allowed to behave certain ways. And they're also taught that this bad behavior is cool, is great. It makes you more of a man. It makes you more sexy, any of that. And that has to be undone. So it starts there.
And not to mention to deny. If you are ever accused of anything, it seems like the current narrative is to deny as much as you possibly can, and never take ownership or accountability for any of your actions.
That's yes, especially those who are caught in the spotlight of all of this and have never realized in their lives that they are part and parcel of this. That they are their behavior has been not ideal, but within the confines of when they grew up and how they grew up. They were acting like everybody else, as far as they could see.
I mean, I'm not asking about any specific. I'm not asking you to relive or relitigate any specific moment in your book, and that's 100% what I'm not asking. But I just think generally it's an interesting time to be having this conversation because in the book you talk about a director asks you to kiss him before he'll give you a part in the film. So he comes out and says that's completely untrue. I mean, a lot of the current moment is about survivors who come forward with stories like you, and whether or not they are believed. So I just want to know how does it feel to write such a painful moment and then just have a denial thrown back at you like that?
I don't think about that. I certainly think about Dr. Ford.
And I mean, that's kind of where
how
I am.
Egregious it was yesterday, or I couldn't even watch yesterday, and President Trump apologized, to the on behalf of the country, for Justice Kavanaugh's ill treatment. And that's egregious as far as I'm concerned. Egregious. And, it really is, you can be outraged and you can be, incensed or any of those, but that doesn't get anything done ultimately. There has to be something on the other side of this. And certainly I personally could not thank Dr. Ford more as a human being, as a woman. I thank her deeply, deeply and profoundly, and we have to keep going.
I just can't imagine what it's like to say something that's so hard to say and then have it be doubted. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, there's, I grew up in I was raised in the 40s. I was born in the 40s, raised in the 50s, came of age in the 60s. It's hard to think that people would take you seriously. I mean, it's hard. That's the hard part. So, overlooking that or finding a way to navigate through that is second nature to me, because that's all there was. So I can't pause and feel what it feels like to be, treated with such great disregard, and how you're not believed and you're trivialized, and you can't. It takes too much time to stop and feel it. You have to just keep plowing on.
This is a really powerful book, and I want to thank you again for coming in. I started the interview by asking you about the title, which I said is something I've never done before. I'm going to end it with something I've never done before either. I'm going to ask you about the cover. Because the cover, and I'll point this out for people listening on the radio. So the front, we had a bit of a discussion in the office about our interpretations of the cover, and this is the reason I ask it. So I think on the front we see you as a young woman. It's a beautiful photo, but the conversation was, does Sally Field on the cover seem vulnerable? Does she seem tentative? And then on the back is, I would say, you now. You're laughing, you're joyful, you seem genuinely happy. Is that intentional? Is there something to be taken from those two images?
Well, I think it's a fade out, fade in. If nothing else, just in age-wise, one of them I'm 27, and the one in the back, I'm like, probably close to 70, 68 or something. And if nothing else, it's just about longevity, I guess.
But do you see does that feel like the same person to you?
As the one in the front and the back? No, I mean, it is the same person. I feel very much the same ingredients, but I have the sturdiness of history holding up my legs, so different than I had in the front cover girl. And
do you think that writing it all out like you did, reliving these moments, has given you an additional sturdiness?
Yes. No question.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Tell me more about that. Like, where does that? How do you feel that?
Well, I didn't for so long. I was when I was just finishing this book last year. I think what month was I doing this? I was I had done a play on Broadway, and my son Sam was finishing up a graduate degree, master's degree at Columbia, and I would go over to his apartment in Brooklyn every day after the Sunday matinee. So this was in May or something of last year. And he was the only one of anyone that I would sit and read some of it at the end because I couldn't figure out what I'd learned. Why? I was saying, Sam, why have I done this? What was I looking for? What did I gain? What did I learn? What was the meaning of all of this? I've just wasted 7 years. I don't know what I'm doing and why. What have I learned? And Sam said, my God, Mother, stop and think for 1 minute. Don't you see how different you are today than you were 7 years ago? How differently you see yourself? And I went, oh, yes. And he was right. It took me a moment to really sort of gather it all up to realize that I in that 7-year period, was able to incorporate, sort of feel the reality of my own history, of my accomplishments, of who I am, the history that I've lived. It was only then that I was able to feel it, and I've always before that felt like any bit of accomplishment I'd ever done was like I was a cup with a big crack in it, and it would drizzle out, and very quickly, and I would go back to feeling that I was a failure. And I realized that I didn't feel that way anymore. That was just gone. I had something that I had done all on my own 2 feet, and after all this time, I owned it.
I think that's a place all of us would love to get. I'm so happy to get to talk to you. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you, Tom.